Okay, I think we go ahead and get started. Morning, everybody. Nice to see all of you. For people that this is their first time, I think I've seen mostly everybody before. My name is Anthony. This is a lecture series brought to you by the Enrico Fermi Institute. This is the Arthur Compton lecture series, and we're talking about particle physics and AI and how the blending of the two is giving us new insights into nature. And this is the fifth lecture, right around Halloween and Day of the Dead, and so today is the fifth one. We're going to be talking about triggering to do real-time event selection. This is building on the last lecture where we started to talk about particle identification and event reconstruction, where we saw the first glimpses of using AI to actually make inferences over very large scales. And so in one slide, kind of the discussion that we had last time was about what I think of as one of the big challenges in particle physics, which is using AI to analyze data. And the process that we looked at was when two protons collide, forming a top quark, the most massive particle, at distance scales on 10 to the minus 15 meters, so extremely small, and then we measure the decay products of it on the meter scale. And the analogy that we made is like if you put the top quark at the position of the Earth, a meter is 1,000 times the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So we're really making inferences using the detector data at the meter scale to understand very small scale behavior all the way down to the femtometer scale. And today what we're going to be talking about is what I consider probably the second big challenge, which is actually collecting data. And so at the LHC, what we do is we collide many protons, and we save only about less than 0.01% of it. To say that in a different way, we throw out around 99.75% of the data that we produce. And to make that decision, we have algorithms that run in real time across tons and tons of fiber optic cables to actually make those decisions at various time scales. And so today what we're going to be doing is first I'm going to give you an overview of this trigger system. So this is going to be roughly a half to maybe 3/4, and then we're going to talk about ideas to use AI in the trigger systems. And so where we're going to start is just a high level what we mean when we think about trigger and data acquisition. So in essence, anytime that you have a high rate experiment, so like the LHC where you're doing many collisions producing tons and tons of data, anytime there's anything high rate, we have an essential subsystem, which is the trigger, that connects from the actual detectors in the collision hall via tons and tons of cables as an intermediary where we decide what to keep, and then we pipe data to large storage farms that are nearby. And so the important thing is that we are ourselves deciding what to keep by teaching algorithms what to identify, and then we let those algorithms run in real time. And so this basic idea has been around for maybe 50, 60 years, much longer than that in spirit, but in practice since the mid-20th century, where basically we were able to come up with electrical circuits, so packaged into these crates that people would move around for different experiments. And what it would do is it would process signals coming from some electronics with a coincidence. So it would be two logics. You'd have two electrical signals come in. If they came in at the same time within a time window, you would say that an interesting event happened. And then if it did happen, you would read out your data. And so these type of systems are used all over. Nowadays, you can even find them in high school physics classes where you have a counter that's measuring radioactive activity, and then it goes into a coincidence logic inside of here, and then you do counts. And so what I wanted to do was start off by showing you this basic idea at a smaller scale to help build up intuition for the larger scales. And so what I want to do is take you to my previous home. And so my previous home, this was in Geneva. So this is Lake Geneva. This is CERN main campus. And in some farmland nearby, there is a warehouse called BB5. And so this is the path that you take going from CERN mainland out among the farms. You see sheep, you see cow, you see tons of stuff out there. And then hidden in right here is a warehouse that actually connects via a giant tunnel to the old collider that was there. And in that warehouse, we were building electronics. So we were building the next upgrade to Atlas. And so you see here the big warehouse. My desk was actually over here, and you would see us running to the espresso machine and then going and actually building stuff from all hours of the day. And we would always see technicians and engineers over here actually constructing the detectors. You can see one of the more finished products where someone is actually hooking up the electrical cables, and then two people, Theo and Stam, who I worked with a lot, actually hooking up fibers, and we would know whenever Theo raised his hand that we had a lot of work to do. So in here, we actually built the system that was just recently installed in Atlas, and those wedges that you see here actually come up onto a system like this. We built 32 of them, and we placed them around here. You might notice this is the image that's actually on the poster for the lecture series. And so we would actually assemble these onto here. And the important thing, this detector was used for two important things now. One was for doing precise measurements of muons as they reach the furthest edges of the detector. And then secondly, for supplying a trigger to Atlas. But you could actually see much earlier on inside of the warehouse that we were doing a very primitive version of a triggering system. And so this is the same picture from before, but blown up a bit. And what I'm going to point out for the next few slides is this system back here, where you see this blue, and then you see a detector, and then actually on a bad day you would see cables flying all over. Theo would walk in and yell at us because they were all crisscrossing and was worried that we were going to break some fiber optic cables. But so you would see a system like this. And actually, if you looked closer under the hood, what you would see is a trigger system. And so what you're looking at here is our detectors before they actually got installed onto the wheel. So we have two of them set up like this. We have a very primitive cooling system, which is our fan, and it sprays a bunch of stuff. Hopefully nothing broke, but you see we would move it around, and then you see all the cables flying around back here. And what was actually happening is we would have particles coming from the sky, so muons coming from the sky, and then we had two other types of detectors, so a scintillator and a photomultiplier tube. What this does is when the particle comes from the sky, it hits a type of material that scintillates, so a lot of light comes out, and then it goes into a tube where those light signals get amplified and then converted into electrical signals. And then from there, they would wrap around to a simple coincidence circuit, which is actually in a big crate, it's that dark area behind. And inside of that crate, it would process signals coming from the top detector up here and the bottom detector down here. And when both of them fired, meaning a particle came straight from down rather than one of them firing and the other one being off, the coincidence logic would send out a so-called accept, and then we would read out all of the data from here, and we would save it to hard drives back there. And so we use this general test stand to test every single piece of electronics, amounting to over 40 million electrical channels. So we tested every single piece of electronics, taking data for around 2 to 3 years. But the thing I wanted to highlight even more was off in this corner over here, we actually took one step higher where we had an external box. So in this external box, instead of using the signals from up here, we actually took the data straight out of the detector and piped it into here. And inside of here, there were custom electronics that instead of doing a simple coincidence between two layers of detectors, it took the actual data from our physical system, ran a more sophisticated algorithm, and then sent out the similar type of accept. And so if you then multiply this by a few hundred and a few hundred years, you get to two very large wheels. And inside of those wheels, some distance away, you actually see the algorithms running inside of here. And so what you'll see is that instead of just having two layers like this, when a particle traverses, you get a coincidence between the two scintillators and photomultiplier tubes. Now there are 8 layers of detectors inside of each one of these. You see 8 layers displayed as vertical lines here. And when a particle traverses, you can have random noise, which is each one of these little dots. Or you can have a particle that goes exactly through, like this check mark here, where you see it hits all the layers in a type of road. And the logic for this road was actually put onto a custom piece of electronics called a field programmable gate array, or an FPGA. And so a pictorial description of this is it sits over here, input comes from here, coming straight from the detector, and then runs on dedicated hardware here. But the important thing about this is that it was able to make decisions more complex than the circuitry we had in the back. It was able to take in data from 8 layers of detectors, and it was able to make decisions in 1 microsecond. So this 1 microsecond is going to be an important feature for the later sections that we talk about. And if I go back 1 slide, and so this basic setup where you have wheels like this, and then you have crates over here, if you were to look here, what you'll see is our detectors now placed. You see one being placed right there. And behind here, all of this support structure is actually tons and tons of those crates. So the electronics, you see cables coming out of the detector, all of these yellow things coming out of the detector, hooking up to boxes identical to this, where you have algorithms running like that. And so this was an extremely primitive version of a trigger, where instead of having just a coincidence of 2 external electronics, you now have a dedicated piece of hardware running inside of here that actually makes a more sophisticated decision. But of course, this is just one piece. Nothing here is ever simple. So this is just a single piece. And that large wheel that I showed you inside of Atlas is actually just this smallest one here. And we have another wheel that is even bigger. And what we actually do in the real experiment is we look for a coincidence between both of these. So the same exact way that here we looked for a coincidence between this upper layer and this lower layer, in the experiment we look for a coincidence between our new small wheel and the big wheel. And why you would want to do that is because if this is where the particles actually collide, when particles fly out, if they're originating from here, then they'll hit both wheels like this. And there's a curvature because there's a magnetic field. But if you have tons of background, like for example, particles just hitting nearby rock and scattering or anything like that, you'll get fake tracks that look like this. And so they'll hit one of the wheels, and then they'll hit the other wheel, but then they won't go all the way back to the interaction point. Or they'll hit the biggest wheel, and because of the magnetic field, actually curve away, and you won't have a coincidence here. So all of this work to create something of this scale was to actually go into a bigger system where we are trying to make coincidences and trigger on interesting events that came from here. So I'm going to pause a second and ask if there's any questions about the basic idea. Yeah?
So you also have like a double check where you see the coincident indicators, but are you also able to identify from just an individual sensor?
Yeah.
From the algorithms that X event has?
Right. So the question was, I see that you have coincidence here. Are you able to identify from an individual sensor that an event happened? If you looked at the detector running, the sensors, everything would be firing a lot. You have noise all over the place. And so what we look for is one sensor firing and then what you expect to happen on another sensor firing. So we can do triggers off single sensors, but the noise is just massive. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think I understand the coincidence, but is it detecting or data that is triggering for, is it like a plane of data, if I'm thinking in a geometric form?
Right. So I can give an easy example here. So starting up here, the question was, I can understand that there's a coincidence, but what is the actual data that you're detecting? Yeah. So up here, in this example where you have particles coming from the sky, it's just these 2 lines here. So when a particle comes from up here, it hits this one, literally just comes down and hits it, a signal's made, and then some amount of time later, based on the space, another signal is made. And now for these detectors, instead of 2 layers, there's 8 layers. So what you see here is it flipped on its side. And now there's 8 layers. And so when a particle comes from the sky, it hits each of the layers, leaves hits on them, and then we read out the signals.
So when you read that, in my mind, it's
Yeah, it's just a line going through like that. Yeah, yeah. And the important part to say there is all of these other hits, so you have a line coming like this, but you have tons of noise for the rest of the detector. So all the other electrical channels can be firing. And so what you really look for is to see this coincidence, the straight line.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
good in my mind that I can see how that's triggering and getting rid of the noise.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Now this detector, is this in the building on top of the earth?
Yeah, this one right here, when we were testing it, is in that farmland above Earth. Yeah.
Is there a hole in the roof or the roof offers no resistance?
No, the particles just fly straight through. Yeah. Yeah.
Do they just cosmic rays then?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I work in electrostatic painting,
Yeah.
where we use 100 kilovolt electrodes to ionize the air.
Yeah.
Through this and through the literature, I learned that in every cubic centimeter, there are 4,000 electrons, free electrons, and 400 electrons, 700 negative ions, and 1,100 positive ions. So it looks neutral when you consider all the charges. Now, I calculated how much electric field of one ion that can generate.
Okay.
For a breakdown to happen, the electric field has to be 3 million volt per meter. Okay. So in this case, I calculated, is it possible that these ions, each one, there's around it certain electric field, and it does exceed the 3 million volt per meter for a distance of about 28 nanometer. And these are floating around. Is it possible that these ions, which they really, when they get close to each other, they can accelerate each other, and they can produce ionization? Could these ones make noise here or a background, or could be the ones that you have detected in the sense of thinking of there is a particle coming from the outer space?
Right. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I'm not sure I followed all of that. Most of what I followed was that you can have background noise from electrostatics that cause signals in the detector. Yeah, and roughly that is absolutely true. And so we have the electrical signals firing a lot. How much it is, like this breakdown of electric field, we weren't seeing so much. What we were seeing was that electrical charge can leave noise hits, and so we had to actually do is calibrate the electronics to set a higher threshold for an electrical pulse when it comes in for it to actually trigger a signal. So if you have a bunch of background noise, it can create a small pulse, and then if you set your trigger level down here, then you'll actually care about it. But if you set your trigger level up here, then you won't care about it. So we did calibrations to try to get away from a lot of this noise. But the exact things that you're talking about, maybe you'll have to explain to me more afterwards. Maybe I'm not fully understanding. Yeah, I want to make sure we don't get too far off track, but yeah.
Okay, this is going to be real quick.
Yeah, yeah.
2012. Number one, was Peter in the building? Number two, were you there? And I guess I'll wait until you pick up the next section, pick up from where I am.
Okay.
But I'm interested in where Peter was, where you were, and the exactly.
In
When that clip, is it 125 or something like that?
in 2012?
Yeah,
Are you asking where I was physically?
yeah.
Oh, I was physically in high school. I was. So, yeah. Say, am I 4? Yeah. Maybe I didn't understand, but afterwards.
I knew that.
Yeah. Okay. 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 So with this basic logic, I wanted to now go from the lab where we're talking about being up above, so up here, and now to go 100 meters underground to where the actual experiment is. So to say again, these are the Alps in the background. This is Lake Geneva here. This is the CERN main complex here. You go 100 meters underground, you have the LHC ring, you have the 4 experiments, and the experiment that we're talking the most about is Atlas, which is right there. And so inside of there, you have this big detector. I think I've showed very simple schematics of it, but nothing quite of this level. What you see here is a 46-meter long cylinder, 25 meters in diameter. Inside of there is subdetectors. So there's 4 major subdetectors. There's inner detectors all the way in the very center next to where the collisions happen. Then it's surrounded by a magnet system. So we have a solenoid magnet that's around here that provides a field to bend particles. Then we have calorimeters around it, and the purpose of these is that when a particle goes, it just deposits a lot of its energy, and then you get a precise measurement of the energy. And then we have toroidal magnets, which is actually what the T in Atlas is. So these big coils right here. So you have them circling entirely, and they produce a magnetic field that also gives bending. And then we have muon chambers all the way on the outside. And for reference, that big wheel that I showed you pictures of that we were building is just this small one right here. Yeah. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Are any of the magnets permanent magnets, or are they all electromagnets? Can be varied in strength.
They're all, you can vary them in strength. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Not so much, but you can ramp them up, you can ramp that. Yeah. Because they weren't, we go in there and actually touch stuff and build stuff, we would all die. Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of crazy just the scale. I mean, these are the small ones that we were building, and I at one point actually stood on top of the wheel when it was outside, and you look down and you kind of get scared. But so this is the actual experiment that we're talking about, and we're really interested in the trigger. And so to give you a different view of this is the surface. You come down 100 meters, you have a cavern like this big area right here, which is kind of a small image. Inside of that, like a ship in a bottle, you have the actual experiment. And so we lower all the detector components down this giant shaft. We assemble it inside of here. And in a room nearby, this so-called trigger room, you have a bunch of electronics, and a different view is like that. And really what you have is the endpoints of 3,000 meters of cables. This is enough cables, I think the number goes, it's enough cables to stretch from LA to Boston. And what it is it's connecting all of the detector electronics to a computer sitting in this nearby room. So you have some fraction of the cables that are running between the detector components, and then you have other fractions that are hooking up to computers that are sitting actually inside of here. And so you can see copper cables running to a bunch of different types of electronics. Many of these are just like the FPGA that we saw before, where it was sitting in that box, but now instead of being above ground, it's below ground. Or you have coincidence logics that are running through these copper cables. And the big thing that we installed this previous round was we did upgrades from copper cables to fiber optic cables. And they give much better transmission rates, but let me tell you, a giant pain to actually install. You have to be careful. If you touch it, maybe it breaks. So there's a lot of things to be careful about. But inside of there, you actually get a much more sophisticated trigger. And so this whole diagram, I'm not expecting anybody to read anything in detail, because I'll walk through parts of it. But this is the logic for our trigger system. So you have Atlas over here, and you have lines connecting to different subcomponents. And the one that I showed you before for the muons is just this single box here. And so you can imagine there's a whole scheme of logic that you have to go through. And this trigger scheme is 2 levels. So there's a level called the so-called level 1 trigger, which is in blue. And this is operating extremely fast. So this is the fastest operating logic. And then we have a high-level trigger, which is in red. And it goes at a much slower speed. And so to say what we're doing is we're taking a frequency of around 40 million collisions per second, and we're reducing that to reading out 100,000. So we do a 400x reduction here, and then we reduce it further down to 3 kilohertz, so we do another 40x reduction roughly. And so this level 1 trigger is the first thing that we're going to talk about for a little bit. And what it's doing, like I said, is a 400x reduction. And a 400x reduction is right away, in real time, you throw away 99.7% of the data. So this is, to me, insane. Yeah. Yeah.
With all that cable,
Yeah.
and the speed of light is not infinite,
Mm-hmm.
1 nanosecond that travels 9 inches, does the speed of light have to be factored in on all these distances? And
Right.
cables?
Right. So the question was, with all of these cables and signals flying everywhere and the speed of light not being infinite, you don't get instantaneous transfers. Do you have to factor all this in? Absolutely. You have to actually count how long do you have to wait before the signal arrives, and be very careful in the firmware and everything to actually keep track of that. And many, many, many hours at 4 a.m. spent calibrating stuff and setting that up. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You have to like measure the actual cable length of each individual cable.
You hope that when you order them, they come and then what is given to you is right. What we end up doing usually is we connect them, we hope that what they tell us is right up to some precision, and then we do a scan, basically telling the hardware, look over this range of cable length. So check if it can be a bit longer, a bit shorter, and scan it. Another thing that takes an excruciating amount of time. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, what I'm saying is, to me, complicated electronic system and the algorithm that give you your final result, how do you calibrate this to see that it's working right?
Yeah.
Do you do it over the whole system, or do you calibrate subsystems and put it together?
Right. So the question was, I see a lot of complex electronics, and do you do calibrations over individual pieces? Do you do calibrations over the full system? And just to make sure that we're using the word calibration the same, and for people to, when we say calibration, I think what we're meaning is you have some expectation for how these electronics are going to work, and then when they're realized in the experiment, there may be differences, and you want to calibrate the electronics so you actually get out what you're supposed to get out. Yeah. And so we do calibrations of each individual electronics separately, and then we put the whole system together, and then we do collective calibrations of the entire detector. So we do multi-stages of calibrations. We do some calibrations between data taking. So you might say the LHC turns off for a little bit. You just let the detector run. You collect noise, and then you calibrate using that. So real-time calibration. You may do calibrations before the detectors are even installed. So like with that big wheel, we did calibrations when it wasn't even installed yet, did measurements that then tune the hardware when it's installed. So we do all sorts of different layers of it. Yeah. Yeah.
This is getting crazier than I don't know, but I'm beginning to lose it. You know that you're not doing a fantastic job.
Yeah.
You are.
Yeah.
But when I add onto the dynamics involved here,
Yeah.
the algebraic geometry involved,
Sure.
I don't care if you want to take it to dimensional, multi-dimensional analysis.
Yeah.
How does the changing geometry of depending on what level you're talking about, this algebraic
Right.
analysis going algebra going on here and this do you use that to distinguish between the high frequency part of it versus the low frequency part of it? It's just getting way too clean.
Right. So I think the question was along the lines of there's a lot of really complex math, like we talked about in the previous lectures. You said algebraic geometry, all sorts of things inside of the theories. And then there's what we're talking about here, which seems like we're talking about electrical signals, complex decisions, but maybe more simple than complex algebraic geometry happening. At the level that we're talking about here, we're tuning the algorithms to take into account what we've learned from theory. So all of these complex algebra things like that go into algorithm design. But at this stage, we're really just talking about electrical signals coming out of the detector. Nothing more complicated. Yeah. I mean, I say nothing more complicated. Very complicated. But yeah.
Along with that, so this complicated trigger, is the design of this a bunch of triggers that you program, or are you writing VHDL and just plowing this into FPGAs, and that the algorithm is always different?
Both. Yeah. Yes. Right. The question was, when you're writing all of these algorithms, it's something I'll touch on a little bit more later. When you're writing, we're saying that there's logic running on all of these. And he was a firmware engineer in the past, so he actually wrote the code that went onto the hardware that we're talking about. And he was wondering, were we actually by hand writing that code and putting it onto the hardware, or is there some automatic process that does it? Different ways you can talk about that, and we do both. Different things like that happen. We run into really bad problems when we start to let people like me and people who are not like him actually write the algorithms, and then things start breaking. So a mix of them. But the thing I wanted to mention about this level 1 trigger, where you're doing this huge reduction, is it's not actually using the information from the whole detector. The very innermost layers of the detector, these inner detectors, where you measure the particle momentum, so you have very thin pieces of silicon right next to the collision points where you may get a ton of data, you don't use at all. You don't use them at all because the data rate is simply too high, and you don't have enough time to process them. We have to make decisions using these electronics in 2.5 microseconds. So this is 2.5 times 10 to the minus 6 seconds. And we have to make those decisions every 25 nanoseconds. So you have 25 nanosecond spacing between the bunches. You have 2.5 microseconds to make this decision, and every 25 nanoseconds, new data is coming in. So we can't actually use the innermost layers of the detector. And so what that translates to is you have algorithms that make rather broad decisions. I was going to find some event displays or something, but I wanted to go actually with just a block diagram to just show you from that big complicated thing, you really just have, I don't know, O of 10 blocks here where you have information coming from the calorimeters, from the muons, from another set of detectors much later on, and then it's effectively just like we talked about, you just have coincidences. So in here, what we're talking about is you have signals coming from the muon detectors, like this wheel. You have signals coming from the calorimeters in here. When they come in to a centralized FPGA in this case, you have a decision, a coincidence that's being made, and then once that coincidence is made, then you send out an accept. So this accept is just like before, where you had two layers of detectors, particle coming from the sky. Once that accept comes out, then you trigger the second stage. And so in doing this, you reduce the rate from 40 million per second down to 100,000 per second. So a 400x reduction. And then once that comes out, you get a second stage. And that second stage is called the high-level trigger, and it's this down here. And from that, you take in this 100 kilohertz, and you do another basically 97% reduction. And you go from 100,000 per second down to 3,000 per second. And so between those, you've thrown away 99.75% of the data. But now at this level of decision making, you have more time. So you actually have 200 microseconds, so 100 times longer to make decisions. And because of that, you can actually process data from the entire detector. When I say process data from the entire detector, usually where my brain goes is you actually have everything firing and you can use everything. What we really mean is some algorithm comes and tells you, look in this region of the detector, so a specific region of interest, and then you can use everything in that area. And so it simplifies the computing time from instead of doing calculations over this 46 by 25 meter experiment to just a small region of interest. And we do all of those calculations off of detector, so not in custom electronics. We do them in a farm that sits over here with 40,000 computers. So 40,000 computers sit in a room, data comes to them, and then we make those decisions. And then after the decisions are made, we get a second accept. And so you can see some of the crates. This is a picture that I've been showing in the past. So you have cables coming into them again. This is off of the detector. You make decisions inside of here. The decisions that you're able to make are more complex than you were able to do before. And then as soon as this level of trigger, the second stage, sends an accept, the data gets written almost instantaneously to hard drives that are much further away from the experiment. Yeah.
So the first stage, the level 1,
yeah.
Does it also tell it what, it sounds like it also tells it where in the detector to look, so you're not even looking at the other sensors at that point, you're only reading from the region
of interest. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, it sounded like the level 1 detector, this first stage, not only did it output a coincidence, but it also told you where the second stage should look. And yeah, so what it does is inside of the algorithms, there's effectively a lookup table where it says, I see a coincidence at this point, and then you map that point to a physical location on the detector. And so I don't know if you remember at the very beginning when I showed this plot from the warehouse where it was like this, and you had lines going like that, and you had the detector like that. Each of those lines like this, you actually convert that directly into a lookup table where you just make roads going like that. So you get both of them. Now, of course, in that statement, there's some trade-offs. Sometimes you get more information, sometimes you get less, but you get both of them that go to the high-level trigger. Yeah?
The data is being generated continuously, but you said you take batches of 25 nanoseconds.
Yeah.
So my question is, what if an event occurs at the boundary? Are these non-overlapping windows? Or?
Right. So the question was, you said you were producing data continuously, but then you also said there's these 25 nanosecond bunches. What happens if data is produced at the edges? So maybe let me clarify that. The 25 nanosecond bunches is you have a beam of protons that in our head was continuous, but is actually divided into tiny bunches of protons flying all around. And the space between those bunches, the time space, is 25 nanoseconds. So every 25 nanoseconds, a bunch of protons come and smash with another one. And so then you have data coming out, and that can look to your detectors if they're not operating fast enough, like a continuous stream. And so the second part of the question was, what happens if data is produced at the end? In some instances, we have dead time, where the detector just effectively is off, and then you miss the data. Other times we have buffers where data that's produced at the end of a bunch can actually still get collected and then fed on. And so there's kind of two different approaches, and you have to be careful with both of them. Yeah. Right. And so when you put all of this together and you actually go and run live, this is what the control room looks like. So you can see in the background the cutout of the experiment. This is actually from first collisions when we turned on the LHC again 3 years ago. You see all of these different desks. So these different desks are for the different subsystems. So you have the calorimeter, you have the inner detector, you have the run control, you have the so-called SLIMOS, which just makes sure that nobody does anything bad. And then you have the muon system. And then over here is actually a relatively calm day, but this is just for the trigger. So this team back here are dedicated experts that whenever we're running the detector, they go in and they monitor the trigger, and in particular, they monitor the algorithms that we design and we include in to take data. So that big scheme that I showed you is more or less telling you where the data is flowing. It didn't say anything about what algorithms are actually running. And so we actually then write those algorithms, come up with the decisions, and put it into that scheme. And then the people that are over here on behalf of the whole collaboration take those decisions and tell Atlas to run them. And what you'll usually see, not like in here, if it's a really exciting day, those people will be running all around because everybody will come and yell at them, or everybody will come and say, I want my trigger, I don't want my trigger. And the reason for that is because really the decisions that are being made there are encoding our physics interests. So it's directly writing to tell Atlas what data to save. And if we've decided as a collaboration that this type of physics is more interesting than this other type of physics, we have limited resources, so we have to select one type and discard the other type. And you can see this happening all the time, where we'll have meetings before we actually turn on the experiment to decide how to allocate our resources. And so when we allocate the resource in different ways, we're making a statement before even analyzing the data about what physics we're interested in and what physics we find exciting. So in upgrading the experiment, so in subsequent runs, we'll actually change these algorithms. So these algorithms we tune by hand, and then we change them, and as the interests of the experiment evolve and our physics reach evolves, so do the algorithms. And so the question, the AI question in this is, can AI enrich our trigger decisions and the physics program? And so now, the next part that I'm going to talk about for maybe 15, 20 minutes is ideas for using AI in the trigger system. I'll say really early on that these ideas are really, some ideas are more on-shell, they're actually being used. A lot of them, this is early days. You could imagine with such a complex system where you're really trying to measure a fundamental property of nature that maybe it's a little bit slow to adopt new techniques. You have this whole system working, you want to leave it working and get the physics out of it. So these new ideas are being adopted now, and they kind of fall into two big themes. So the two themes, I think probably you could guess them. One is smarter and one is broader. So two big classes. In essence, what they're talking about is smarter is going to be how we actually read the data to decode the particles that we see here. And then broader is to be more agnostic to any biases about what we assume is going on. So smarter and broader. And so to say again, what we mean by smarter is that the algorithms that we're designing now are able to make more complex and more informed decisions. So that's to say that when you throw in these two particles and things come out, you have tons and tons of measurements along the way. And we saw at different stages of the trigger, you have different levels of complexity. So if you're using all of the detector, with more time, you can make more complex decisions, like, for example, that you see a jet, a spray of particles from which bottom quark initiated it, or you have two leptons coming like this. And then also making more informed decisions where trying to get the earliest level of decision making actually utilizing the full detector. But of course the issue here is that we have really strict time and resource constraints. And so the first one is this more complex, and actually last time you already saw the first instance of this. What we were looking at is when you have a top quark decaying, you get a W quark, and that creates this spray of particles, and that leaves some interesting hits in the detector. And then what we saw is that we're actually creating algorithms each year that get better and better at identifying when these B quarks actually initiate. And so what you're looking at here as a refresher is this is the year along this axis, so starting from 2017 all the way up to 2023. The 0 point here is a classical algorithm, and then each one of these is some AI algorithm. And you see the gradual improvement, where actually what you're seeing is a massive improvement. So it's going from a level of 0 to basically a 5x improvement. And what this means is that for every, at this level, 2,500, so for every 2,500 times you see a light quark, you actually only misidentify it once. And remember, when we're talking about discoveries where you have 30 events, 2,500 versus 30 is a big, big difference. So the first thing is more complexity in decision making. But of course, the problem there is that these algorithms take a long time to run. So this algorithm that I'm talking about here will run on a CPU or on a graphics processing unit and will take milliseconds to run. So 10 to the minus 3 seconds. But we said that we need decisions on the microsecond time scale. And more than that, it's not just that the algorithms need to run on the microsecond time scale, the data actually needs to flow on that time scale too. And so now what you're starting to see in the experiments is alternative flows and lighter algorithms. So this is one of the components of the level 1 trigger, the earliest level. And this is what we call here a low rate path, which remember is actually an extremely high rate path. But now we have an alternative route, which is even higher rate, and we do a subset of the calculations inside of there. And so this was actually done by a grad student I worked a lot with when I was in Geneva. And so what the big idea here was instead of doing all those complex calculations that you could do at slow speeds using the full detector, instead do even more compressed regions and do lighter weight calculations. And so doing that, you're actually able to get decisions within these 200 microseconds and even sometimes within 2 microseconds. And the second thing is to be more informed. So recall that the decision making that we're doing, we said 99.75% of the data doesn't use the whole detector. That, every time I look at it, I find incredible. You throw away so much data and you don't use kind of the most precise pieces of the detector. And so it's this whole black area here. And there's actually new ideas for how we can get at this. So much of these ideas come from doing on-detector filters to reduce the data rate. And so the two examples that I'm going to mention is one on the competing experiment on CMS. They're doing an upgrade in the next few years where they'll take part of that layer and install a new type of electronics where right on the detector you can throw away any types of data that comes from uninteresting types of physics. How you do that is exactly like we saw with the two coincidences in the very beginning where you have two layers and if a particle goes through like this, it hits both. Same exact logic, but now put it all the way down onto the millimeter scale, and that's what they're putting inside. So they just have layers like this, particle comes through, you see hits on both. If there's hits on both, you save it. If there's not hits on both, you throw it away. There's even newer ideas, and so this is actually the thing that I work a lot on at Fermilab. This is a new type of chip. So underneath this gray thing right here is a very small piece of electronics, and written straight onto the silicon, we can put a neural network that then can analyze the data 40 million times per second and make these type of complex decisions in real time. And so what that's meaning is that we don't have to upgrade the actual detector itself, so the material that when a particle hits creates this signal. We can upgrade the processing unit that is attached to the detector and have that processing unit make more complex decisions. And so this is something that is under R&D right now, but I'm going to guess that some combinations of these will be used on future experiments. And now the second theme, talking about broader, this is probably the one that you'll have heard maybe more about, and it's designing algorithms that cast a wider net. And so the idea here is just simply that maybe our intuition about nature is wrong. You could ask, why are we in this position? So the question is, we have all of these particles. We found the Higgs boson. We have the other force carriers, the quarks and the leptons. We have outstanding problems. We want to find new evidence. But we've already discussed that at the LHC, we've seen no hints of new particles so far. That in itself is causing us to question if the ideas that we have about what nature has in store to answer those questions is right. And encoding that idea that we're actually wrong into algorithms has interesting implications. And the biggest of them for me in one sentence is that it just breaks the typical paradigm, and hence, to my simple brain, is very confusing. And this falls generally under the name model agnostic. And so the idea here is that you train some AI algorithm on real data, so data coming straight out of the experiment. And inside of that data, you know that the model of nature is right. So before we were training algorithms on simulations of what we think is happening in nature. Now the idea is you train directly on data. So you teach your algorithms to just understand what's happening in the data. And then you look for times where you get two collisions that result in something weird, that results in some type of event that doesn't look like everything else. And you can take that idea and encode it into an implementation. And the basic scheme is just using so-called data compression. And what you do is if this is what normally happens, this is everything else in nature, you run it through a box, and as it goes through the box, you throw away a bunch of information, tons of auxiliary information, and then you try to reconstruct what comes out at the end. So the flow would be you have an event looks like this, passes through, and looks like this. And I really mean here almost literally that you take a picture of the event, you put it in the box, you throw away information, and then on the other side of the box, you get out a similar looking picture. But now the interesting thing is if you have a type of anomalous event that doesn't look like what you usually see, and you put it into the same box, what you'll get out at the end is really blurry. So you'll get a picture on the other side that looks just like this. And then you'll get a collection of these, and you can ask, well, why do these look so weird? And the answer to why these look so weird is, I have no idea. This is probably part of the problem. This is an exciting idea. I mean, it's really changing things. So instead of teaching your algorithms, instead of sitting down, taking a chalkboard, writing out a theory, then doing simulations and teaching the algorithms based on your understanding, you do the experiment, and then you just let the algorithm look at the data in real time and gain an understanding of nature. But then, of course, that makes it more difficult for us to understand what it's actually learning, what it's actually doing. And so we have instances of these algorithms running at the first layer of decision making and getting new events that we wouldn't have triggered on before, like this. So this is from the CMLS collaboration. And what you can see here is a ton of stuff. The detector is completely lit up. You have 12 jets of particles. So each of these kind of orange sprays are jets of particles. You have a muon coming all the way out here. And if you look deep, deep inside, you would see many, many hits along the innermost tracking layers. So this was one of the events that has been saved by one of these new anomaly detection algorithms. And if I'm most honest, when I look at this, I don't really know what to do. I'm kind of confused of, okay, I see the detector is completely lit up. I see you have a lepton. I don't really know any theories that easily generate this. How many of these do you have? Kind of unclear. And so this, you can even see the date, is really brand new. I mean, these event displays, it's kind of 1 year gap between them, and this is May 2023. So it's a brand new algorithm running now, and I know grad students who are doing PhDs trying to analyze and understand these. And the big problem in all of this is almost more of a philosophical question, is how do you define an anomaly? What does it mean for an event that you see to look different than all of the other events? Because after all, what we're talking about are these probability distributions to get different types of collisions. And so if you have an anomalous event, is it just that you're taking more data, so it's more likely you're going to see weird things? Or is it that you're really finding new physics? And so between those ideas, there's tons and tons of algorithms that are being made and designed right now. So some of them are included in, some of them aren't. And actually, this is part of, there's a growing consortium at CERN, this so-called next-gen trigger, where it's combining the expertise from the different experiments to come up with new algorithms that will be deployed the next time the LHC turns on, which will be roughly 2030. And so I added a link here to an article you can go read, and I expect that out of this, there's going to be tons and tons of ideas. And so we're running out of time, so I think I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly. So this is the question. What I hope to tell you from all of this is that we have this scheme, this so-called trigger scheme, what it does is it takes the data flows and reduces the rates at different points. And as it's reducing those rates, we have algorithms running. And it's up to us, the physicists, and the engineers and the computer scientists, whoever's working on this, to come up with the algorithms that get run in real time. And just in the past 10 slides or so, you've seen maybe 3 examples of cases where AI is starting to have an impact. And so now, as this is 2023, you saw in the event display, where we're going for the next 5-6 years, is exploring those ideas, seeing if we can actually enrich the physics program, and then installing them in the future. And so that general idea will kind of lend us to what we're going to talk about next time. This idea of using simulations, not using simulations, we've talked a lot about theory predictions being converted into algorithms. So next time I'm going to talk about the third big challenge that I see, which is actually doing these simulations. So that's to say that we rely on really high fidelity, high precision conversion of our theory into detector observables. And that conversion is, you can imagine, very complex and computing intensive. And the biggest issue is that as we ramp up the number of collisions, we're going to get so much data where you also need more simulations. You need more and more and more simulation. And so next time, we're going to talk about it if AI can have a role here. So I think I'm about at the end. I'll stay as long as people have questions, but thank you so much for your time.